All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to speak here today. What I want to do is explain the state of New Jersey's basically four-pronged approach to resilience at this point. Science, planning, regulations, engineering. The subcontext here is that what we want to do is push as much planning work into the communities, into the municipalities as we can to start. This does not mean that we're leaving municipalities on their own at all. It just means that we need their involvement. We need to know what they expect, what they want their towns to look like as we move forward in this century, as climate change begins to have major impacts on just about everything in the state. So let me begin with the science. We prepared, at the request of Governor Murphy, the first scientific report on climate change. It's quite extensive, 200 pages that covers everything related to increased temperature. And what's really good about this report, it's very New Jersey centric. We don't follow the big trends internationally or nationally. We're looking at how temperature rise is going to impact the state, whether it's sea level rise, increased precipitation, impacts on agriculture. It's all in here. This is the first report. As the science changes, as we become more aware of what increased temperatures are going to bring, we're going to update this report. Taken from the report, again, we're looking at rising temperatures, increased precipitation, sea level rise, changes to water quality, drought, extreme weather, ocean acidification, you name it, we cover it in this report. The impacts that we have to really mind are on the socially vulnerable populations, on our infrastructure, on the citizenry health and well-being, our ecosystems, et cetera. And there's really, as I said, nothing in New Jersey that's not going to be impacted by what we're expecting. Now, the first thing we wanted to do was take a look at our state operations. Governor Murphy formed the Interagency Council on Climate Resilience. All the major agencies are here. They're all going to be impacted, whether their mission or their operating procedures, their regulations, the way they give out money. We want to make sure that we're all pushing in the same direction in order to make the state more resilient. Involving the other agencies in the development of the state's climate change resilience report, which was just released yesterday or the day before in its final form, involving them early on, getting them on board with the impacts that we expect, getting them thinking on how the state is going to respond collectively here. It was very important. And of course, this is the climate change resilience strategy. It's actually 6 strategy sets. You can see them here: resilient and healthy communities, resilience of ecosystems, promoting coordinated governance in a state that's 565 municipalities. We don't have Dutch water districts here. We have political municipalities, and that presents a whole different set of realities as we go about trying to get to resilience. Priority 4, investing in information and increased public understanding. You know, without the public on board, we're not going to be able to make the policy changes that we need made in this state. So investing in the information, including the science, and getting it to where the public can understand it is going to be critical to our success. Promoting climate-informed investments, innovative financing. There's not enough money in the world to get us there on our own. What we need to do is figure out other different ways of funding the actions, the strategies that we've set forward. And then if you take the first 5 strategy sets and zoom in on the coast, that is the Coastal Resilience Plan. We are in New Jersey. Most people don't think of us like this, but we are very coastal oriented. We have a lot of coastline. A lot of impacts are going to be felt by rising seas. Now, in getting to the subcontext here of moving planning down, and we don't want to push down too far because, as I said, we don't have water districts, we have municipalities, but really what we have are regions that are going to be affected similarly as the climate change impacts manifest themselves. So what we did was, what we're doing is funding through Resilience NJ 4 different areas to look at their communities collectively and develop resilient solutions to the problems they're facing. You can see Northeast New Jersey, Long Beach Island, Raritan River and Bay, and Atlantic County coastal region, which is Barrier Island. Every community is going to face similar impacts. Communities across the board are going to find that their impacts are very similar to other places, particularly the neighbors. So that's what this planning effort is about, developing solutions for areas of the state. This is supposed to be a model for how municipalities can get together on a regional basis and look for solutions. We've also provided to municipalities and therefore regions local planning for climate change toolkit. The idea here is that while municipalities are fairly self-sufficient, not all have the means to and the expertise to develop resilience plans. To increase their capacity, we release this toolkit to include the necessary steps, associated resources to allow municipalities to undertake planning efforts as much as possible on their own. Within that toolkit, we have a section called Equitable Community Resilience Evaluation Toolkit. What this does is make sure that in this planning process, what we've done is not left out those stakeholders that have maybe traditionally been left out for reasons like geography, economic status, age, education, mobility limitations, and cultural or ethnic differences. Everybody has to be at the table. If the table looks like every other table we've had in the past, that's not good enough. We need people participating that haven't participated yet, particularly the most vulnerable people in this climate change area. We have looked at municipal action possibilities. And what we've done is charted out how the municipality might go about looking at its vulnerabilities, its existing let's say positivities instead of vulnerabilities. What is on hand for them to help themselves develop a plan? We've also taken the science for municipalities and provide guidance on how to use that science. It's not enough to say that by 2100, which is the state's planning horizon, that we may see an increase of sea level between 2 and 5 feet. Or that in 2050, we're guaranteed to see sea level rise between 1 and 2 feet. What do you do with that? Well, we provide in this guidance an idea of the type of activities that may lend themselves to the municipality looking at 2050 or 2070 or 2100. What do you do with that information as it impacts municipal functions? If you're going to be building a park and it's only going to, and you're willing to take a chance on 2 feet of sea level rise by 2050 because one, the park's not that expensive, you're not investing too much in it, good 30 years of use may be enough. But if you're building something more substantial than a park, you may want to take a good look at what's going to happen beyond a 30-year horizon. We are funding activities that we haven't traditionally funded. We're all for risk communication in many ways. People learn in many different ways. So what this exercise is through our New Jersey State Council on the Arts, through local community-based organizations, is helping local artists with art installation projects to communicate risk of climate change to the populace. And of course, getting the public involved in any way, such as My Coast, New Jersey, where the public submits photos of storm events, of flooding, of tidal problems that they observe on a routine basis. Getting them involved is like the first step in getting them to understand what is happening, and therefore, again, as I said, enable us to change our policies and understand our regulatory changes. But it's not all about planning. Yes, planning is absolutely necessary, always. Regulations are important here, and we are reviewing and changing our regulations in order to protect against climate change. Particularly, we're looking at how our flood hazard areas are going to change with rising sea levels, with increased precipitation, and therefore runoff. These are the rules that are going to have to change. Our coastal zone management rules, our flood hazard area, freshwater wetlands, stormwater rules. So planning, regulations, they go hand in hand. And then the engineering. We're working with various federal agencies, in this case, HUD, in order to construct flood walls, as you see in pink, at the north end and south end of Hoboken, where during Sandy, the tidal surge came into Hoboken and filled up the back half. I don't know if you can see my cursor. No, you probably can't, because oh, there it is. This back half of Hoboken is a bowl filled up with water. What we want to do is keep the surge from entering by building flood walls here. Again, very expensive project. It could be a model for how we need to go about protecting other areas like Weehawken to the north and Jersey City. Very expensive. Lots of these projects will be that way. As we build projects, as we design them, as we engineer them, we want to bring the public along. We want them to understand what we're doing. We want them to understand how we're protecting them. That's how you get the local support. This is a rendering from the Hoboken project. In the yellow is a wall being incorporated into community, so we don't disturb the community as much as possible. In the Meadowlands, also a rebuild by design project. What we're trying to do is not protect the cities, the 5 main cities here, for example, Carlstadt and Moonachie and Little Ferry. What we're trying to do is protect the cities from water within due to stormwater and precipitation. This is about getting water out of the cities as fast as possible, making the best use of existing stormwater conveyance systems, updating them, get the water out of there as quick as possible. And we are working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on a major project, actually 2 major projects. One is in the Back Bay area of the state, and the other is in the New York and New Jersey harbor area. But these slides are about the Back Bay study. I think most of you probably heard of this. What we're looking at are various ways of keeping storm surge out of the Back Bay area behind our barrier islands. This is hardcore civil works projects. Also, again, very expensive. The tentative plan from the Army Corps is $16 billion with about $200 million of annual maintenance costs. If you look at this storm surge barrier across one of our major inlets, the Great Egg, you can see that this is why it's expensive. You're looking at here a sector gate in the center and lift gates on the sides. This is designed to keep surge out, not sea level rise. That's a whole different problem that the Corps was authorized to study. This is their tentative plan. There's a lot of work to be done on environmental issues, economic issues. But right now, we are a sponsor of this study. We wanted to know what the possibilities were, and the Corps is certainly providing us with those possibilities. Another example of a Corps project as part of this Back Bay study. What you're seeing in orange are basically flood walls tying into higher ground to the left, to the west. Just another example. And then the Corps also looked at elevating homes in areas that were not conducive to engineering projects. This is basically the whole south end of Cape May County, where they want to look at raising or buying out the homes in this area. Initial cost, $3.2 billion to do this. So again, early stage of this, they have a feasibility study on the street for review. We've submitted our comments. We have a lot of comments. It's just another way of making the state more resilient. All right, so what I've shown you are the four-pronged approach to resilience in New Jersey, all about getting municipalities on board with the state, getting them together in regions where we can be much more efficient with our resources and get resilient quicker. Thank you.
Excuse me. Can you hear me now, everybody?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you, Dave. Sorry that there seems to be static on my end here. I just want to thank you for your presentation and introduce Rob Freudenberg from the Regional Planning Association.
Great. Thank you. I'm just about to share my screen here. And let's see. Can folks see it? I have no idea what it looks like, but hopefully it's okay. I'll see if I can go to full screen. Okay. All right, so thanks. I've kind of tongue-in-cheek named my presentation, Regional Adaptation Planning is Hard, but Regional Adaptation Planning is Necessary. So I'm going to cover a few things here, but really, in some ways, building on what Dave has presented. Because when Dave mentions regional, it's a little different than the way I think of regional in some ways. I think Dave, in his job and in his effort, is focused on regions within the state. But I work for an organization that covers the New York metropolitan region. So this is, when we say regional, this is the kind of scale of region that I'm thinking about. And I think that's important. So when I say regional adaptation planning is hard, you can see why it might be hard. We're crossing state boundaries, we're crossing municipal boundaries, we're thinking about things at a much bigger perspective that we're just not necessarily geared to think about. So this is the region that I work for. We're a nearly 100-year-old organization that is focused on the health, equity, prosperity, and sustainability of the New York metropolitan region. We don't cover all of New Jersey. We don't cover all of Connecticut or all of New York. We cover the parts of these states that are tied to the core of the region, which is New York City. And you can see the stats on our region. We're called Regional Plan Association because we put out a regional plan basically once every generation. Our first plan was done in 1929, laid out a lot of the blueprint for things that we now live with today in some ways. The regional highway routes is one example we show here, for better or for worse. This is something we thought through. You see some of the maps behind me are from this plan as well. By the 60s, things had changed so much. We come through the war, we're in the post-war boom, and we did a second regional plan that really focused on looking at the region in subregions, which is another important piece here. By the 90s, again, things had changed so much that we did a third plan. And this was really kind of focused at the sustainability level at curbing sprawl, advancing policies that ensured that we were not going to gobble up every last forest, field, and agricultural site. And then you can see the time between our plans gets shorter and shorter because things change more quickly. And in 2017, this was post-Sandy, post-Bridgegate, there were things that were happening where we thought that climate change was an issue that we hardly addressed in the third plan. Governance was something that just seemed to be broken at that point. And then issues of equity really started, we started to see how the region had been really stratified into kind of those who were doing really well and those who were not. And this is why I put out a fourth plan in 2017. This forms the basis of the work that we do today. So just to kind of drill in for a second here, like I said, one of the key areas of this plan, a pillar of it, was the need to rise to the challenge of climate change. And this is both from the mitigation or carbon reduction approaches as well as the adaptation approaches. And within this group of actions, and you can check out our plan, I think it's fourthplan.org. It's a really interesting report to see. In doing the research for this plan, I remember one of the earliest things I asked for was, can we just see our region with land and water and nothing else? We have so many maps that have so many different things, but what does this binary map look like? And it really let us see, you can see the interconnected reasons why we're a region. We're a region because of infrastructure, but also because of our natural infrastructure. And it was really clear that we are a region of water. The rivers, the bays, the ocean, all the little streams, we are a region of water. And in some ways that is to our benefit, but as climate change intensifies and the effects really start to amplify, being a region of water is a threat as well. There are currently 23 million residents in the region as we define it. About 1 million of them live in areas that are prone to flooding today on the coasts and along the floodplains of our rivers and streams. By 2050, with sea level rise and other flood risks, we estimate about 2 million, it'll double to about 2 million people at risk, about a third of which could be considered socially vulnerable. People with lower incomes, people who are elderly, children, people who have been historically marginalized. A third of them are at significant risk of flooding by 2050. There's also 1 million jobs that will be at risk of flooding, as well as power plants, oil refineries, rail yards, much more. Our critical infrastructure is at risk. And again, if you remove the state boundaries and kind of look at how all of this is connected, you see that we absolutely need to have the baseline of everything Dave was talking about at the state level resilience planning, but we put forward and believe that there is a need for regional resilience planning. And I'll talk, use the Meadowlands actually as a case study to show just why. So it's clear, we must adapt to make our communities more resilient. If we stopped emitting carbon today, we'd be living with the consequences of climate change and need to adapt moving forward. So what is the state of resilience in our region? We know the threats, Dave kind of ran through them briefly, and they are getting worse. A lot of planning has been done, but very little comprehensively. And when I say that, I mean across the boundaries and across the agencies that I'm always glad to see Dave talk about, the Interagency Council. This is one of those things where if you can just get your agencies on the same page and working together, there's a lot more that can be done. Investments have been made. Dave showed some of them as well in New Jersey. We would say this is our judgment call, not all wise and not always in the right places. And then policy responses need to keep up with the times. This is a case where, the saying you're learning to fly the plane while you're in the air. We've never planned for climate change before. We never had to adapt before to climate change. So we are learning this on the spot, and we need to respond to that and keep up with what we're learning. And I think the science that Dave references is key there. So I will just run through this briefly. Dave touched on them. Obviously the threats from a coastal flooding perspective, or from a flooding perspective, our storm surge. Sandy was our wake-up call, remains our wake-up call from the coastal flooding. It has far-reach storm surge and hits places that we developed into the wetlands and the floodplains of our region, and now we have to bear the brunt of that. Sea level rise, clearly an issue, certainly for the long term, and coming up quickly on us. That's something we need to plan for. The projects that we're planning for coastal surge, as Dave mentioned, don't necessarily address sea level rise, and that's something that we need to think about. We did a report in 2016 kind of saying, hey, there's a difference between how you plan for storm surge, say the top image, where storms come, do their damage, and then you rebuild, versus the kind of slow, persistent rise of sea levels, where at some point, this picture on the bottom, which was not during Sandy, was during just a high tide, your communities will be living in this state at every high tide at some point, and then permanently beyond that. Just to give you a sense of, I guess I see, the screen has stopped advancing. There we go. So, we did that report and looked at sea level rise in 3 different segments, 1 foot, 3 foot, and 6 foot. And you see how if you kind of move along that spectrum, that sea level rise flooding moves from more of a suburban issue, if you look where the dark blue is and the back bays that Dave was mentioning, to more of an urban issue as we get to the higher levels. And we're talking about residents, we're talking about jobs, and as the next images will show, we're talking about infrastructure. This is kind of the property value thing. This is Union of Concerned Scientists, did some great work a few years ago. They grabbed their information and applied it to the region. You see Northern New Jersey and Long Island are the leaders in property value at risk from sea level rise flooding as you move out, although actually the whole time, both of them are. And then this is from our own maps where we did the 1, 3, and 6 feet in low-lying areas. And pardon me for showing some New York pictures here to a New Jersey crowd, but that's the spirit of regionalism. And just to show that, we're not just talking about communities. I think a lot of focus is on the homes and those things, but we're talking about infrastructure. In this case, JFK is actually pretty safe from sea level rise. It's built on high enough fill to withstand that. But you see the other things here: public housing, wastewater facilities. These are things that we really haven't adapted to sea level rise before. And I'll say in the urban context, we really don't know how to adapt. Look at that peninsula, that Barrier Beach. There's a lot of people there and in dense conditions, and urban adaptation buyouts in the urban context. We're going to need to figure that out. This is LaGuardia Airport. Beyond 3, 4, 5 feet of sea level rise, it's underwater. That's a regional, that's a national, that's a global issue. This is Newark Airport. We saw it flood during Ida, and this is why. It was built in what was the Newark Meadows. It's the Hackensack Meadowlands, and Newark Airport was built in the Newark Meadows, so it is built on a wetland. We've been told before Newark Airport will be okay because the turnpike is there to stop the water. I don't know if that's a great solution, and we'll have to figure out the turnpike too. But essentially, of the port, the turnpike, and Newark Airport all at risk, major regional assets. And this is the Back Bays area that Dave was talking about. You see how the Back Bay gets threatened first before the ocean coast, because that's where kind of the lowest land is. A lot of population, a lot of infrastructure. And this is the Meadowlands. We'll talk about it in a little more detail in a bit, but it's one of the most at-risk places. And Dave talked about the need to move inland water out. There is also the need to figure out what we're going to do about the sea level rise flooding that will inundate these small communities with a lot of population. Pardon me, I have a cold as well, so I apologize for the scratchiness. We also had a wake-up call again with Ida that extreme rain is a problem, something we're going to need to do a better job of addressing. So, our fourth plan really focused on 4 areas: adapting to a changing coastline, bringing nature into our communities, improving the natural and built systems that sustain us, and create a greener energy system. So about the adaptation and mitigation. I just want to drill in on one recommendation since it's kind of pertinent to this conversation and spend the rest of my time talking a little bit about that. We called for a regional coastal commission and state adaptation trust funds. Basically this is the idea that we need to start thinking across boundaries and have people like Dave talking to counterparts who maybe don't yet exist in some of these places, but talking to his counterparts in New York City, in Connecticut, that we start thinking about these things regionally, because there's a need to not just kind of focus at the state level because we are interconnected. I just came from our board meeting where Eric Adams, who's the potential next mayor of New York City, someone asked him this question of how you're going to do things differently with our neighboring states. And he said, I'm going to talk to them, do something radical and revolutionary and talk to people in New Jersey. So, I think it just shows how we can kind of stay confined in our state and local boundaries. But really recognize that, this is a fluid region. We are moving back and forth and share a lot. So, the idea of this, we put out a plan to kind of fill it out after the fourth plan, is really have a coastal commission, excuse me, that, works on a regional adaptation plan. How are we doing this together? What are the different states and local entities doing, and how does that add up to a whole? Dave mentioned the importance of science-informed standards. Coordinate and encourage collaboration around adaptation. This kind of gets to the shared infrastructure, our transit lines, et cetera. And also, such a commission could help to manage and oversee adaptation funds. Again, back to the Meadowlands, just to illustrate the point, this is a place that is essentially the bottleneck of our critical infrastructure. If you think of driving through the Meadowlands, taking a train through the Meadowlands, you can kind of see everything come together, the roads, the train lines, the power lines. This is a critical bottleneck. And so it is one of the most regional places in our region, pardon me. And, kind of turn the Meadowlands on its side, sorry for the change in perspective. Obviously you see there are population centers in the Meadowlands that, these are people who are living in the Meadowlands, maybe working in the Meadowlands, but also working regionally. Probably some people here work in New York City, and I think there's this regional connection there. The Meadowlands is a major employment center. Over 50,000 jobs are at risk of permanent flooding. These are the warehouses, the major facilities that kind of keep this region, fulfilling its need of commerce. They're located here because of the location of the roads and the transportation networks. And if we lose these places, we have regional unemployment, regional challenges. Like I mentioned, critical transportation lines, trains, roads pass through here, airports, and are at significant risk. This isn't just a local issue. This isn't just a state issue. If our train lines run into water in the Meadowlands, you shut down the whole Northeast corridor. Same for our trucking routes and the turnpike and the parkways. And then finally, the critical facilities, our wastewater, our fuel systems, power plants, lots here that keep the region moving and powered. And then, we have to think about the impact of contaminated land. What does rising seas do to this land? That has regional implications as well from a natural perspective. So again, back to the plan, we were saying this commission could kind of help manage these things together. We've since kind of backed off the idea of a regional coastal commission and think maybe there's a better need for just better coordination around this, maybe not an appointed commission. We're still thinking through the details on this. But one thing we'll certainly need to do this is probably going to be, as Dave mentioned, there's no shortage, there's no end to the money that will be needed to adapt. It's probably the biggest investment we'll need to make in our lifetimes, just that small coastal portion of large coastal portion of the state, $16 billion, $2 billion in Hoboken, one city. And this is kind of a slide, maybe slightly unfair, but it's a slide that shows our current ongoing dedicated adaptation funding. There's nothing there. We don't have such a thing of where we're saying this is something that we refill every year to focus on adaptation funding. Now we do have things like Blue Acres and coastal engineering funds that come in. These things come in reliably, but the way that we get most of our adaptation funding now is by having a disaster. And that is a broken cycle that we want to get out of. We need something permanent and ongoing. And that can be done regionally, that can be done locally, but there are ways that we can invest this money that support regional adaptation. Sorry for the blurriness here. This is my last few slides. After we put out this recommendation, we put together a climate adaptation network that kind of went across the 3 states. You know, it really focused on ways to kind of break down the barriers between communities facing similar issues so they can coordinate. I think this is the idea that there needs to be a place where people across the region can come together and talk about what's working and what's not and share with each other. So it was a really effective 1-year project. It didn't get refunded, otherwise it would still be going because it was really useful. These are the kind of communities that participated in it. We see kind of good representation from throughout the region. And you know, the lessons learned from that project was that there is demand for sharing approaches. People were eager to know what other municipalities, states, counties were doing, and they took that information back home. It came out that a need for common science, you know, for having scientific standards around these issues is critical. Adaptation funding was key here. And then planning ahead, really necessary. It's obvious, but you know, you can get stuck in just kind of the planning for the day to day. Now, I will note that there were reservations about regional governance. People don't want to add an extra layer of bureaucracy, and we understand that. So I think the thing that we would take forward from this as an organization advocating for this is all these things above that line. Maybe we don't have a kind of commission, but find ways to ensure that we're sharing these approaches, that we're working across boundaries, that we're thinking about the infrastructure that serves, you know, not just the community that we're talking about, not just the state that is connecting the region together. We're gonna have to focus on those things together, and we think there's good opportunity to do that. Final couple slides here, take a coordinated approach to plan for resilience across boundaries, invest in the most relevant resilience approaches in the most appropriate places, continually refresh planning approaches. And then finally, you know, we need to figure out what are the gaps in our current resilience planning efforts. How do we best engage stakeholders and communities across boundaries, and how do we ensure ongoing dedicated funding to invest? And then we hope, this is a call for leadership, that we can have continued leadership around this issue in places like New Jersey, and that we work together to kind of lead on this, particularly with a regional approach. I think my voice is done, but thank you.
Okay, and Rob, I've shared my screen. Do you can see it? So,
See it.
okay, so should I simply start and hope that the feedback will vanish somehow?
Yep, they say go ahead.
Okay, if there's no other sign that I shouldn't do so. So, good afternoon from my side, from Germany to the US. And I was asked to give a brief introduction into climate change adaptation in the German environmental and spatial planning system. And I will, okay. I would like to do that in 3 little chapters. Firstly, I would like to introduce the formal planning system in Germany a little bit, because it's quite different from what you know or I know from the US, and especially Wolfram Höfer asked me to introduce that a little bit. As I think that also in the US, what I've learned from the 2 lectures before, climate change adaptation is mostly a part of informal planning in Germany. So the 3rd question or chapter is how this informal part could be integrated into formal planning instrument to get a stronger legal liability, and that there's a stronger responsibility to fulfill the requirements. So I would like to start with landscape planning or Landschaftsplanung in Germany. I was really very much thinking about to use the term landscape planning because it might mislead people from other countries. It has not that much or even nothing to do with something like gardening or even with landscape architecture concentrating on very small areas. It's rather something that one could also name as environmental land use planning. And it doesn't deal only with things like landscape or the scenery, the beauty of landscape and recreation, but also with biodiversity, most of all. but also with soil, water, climate, and air. What you can see here, some assets are in italics. This means that they are regulated not only by landscape planning or the basis for it, the Federal Nature Conservation Act, but also by other laws, and there are also other institutions in charge of it. Landscape planning has the aim to substantiate, or the task to substantiate, the aims of nature conservation as laid out in our conservation laws for the planning area, and also to develop and indicate the requirements and measures which are needed to realize those aims. And what is very important, these plans exist on different levels. On the level of the federal states, we have 16 federal states in Germany. On the level of a region, which usually consists of, let's say, 3, 4, or 5 counties, plus sometimes some bigger cities. Then we come to the local level, the entire municipality, where we have the local landscape plan, as well as on a sub-local level, for some parts of a municipality, the open space or open green or green space plan. You see, those plans have different scales, which of course means that they are able to address different areas or different sizes of areas. So here again on the right-hand side, the strand of area covering planning, which is environmental land use or landscape planning, with the plans I've just named. And on the other side, we have a kind of comprehensive spatial planning on exactly the same levels. We have a state development plan, a regional plan, a preparatory land use plan, which might be similar to the zoning plans in the US, and a binding land use plan. So the main idea behind that is that the plans on the upper level are more here to design or to think about a programmatic level, to come up with the big outlines, whereas the plans on the lower levels have to detailize these aims of the plans on the higher levels. And what's the reason that we have this parallelity of spatial planning and landscape planning? Landscape plans have to be integrated into spatial planning, or let's say some contents or aims or measures of landscape planning have to be integrated into the correspondent spatial or land use plan in order to become legally binding. Usually landscape plans are not legally binding for themselves as long as they have not been integrated into the spatial plans. So the regional plan or the preparatory land use plan, for example. And this has to be done by the respective authorities in balancing nature conservation or landscape planning issues with other interests and requirements on the space. For example, the building development, transportation, water issues, agriculture, and so on. Of course, we have other environmental plans and assessments, be it for nature reserves, be it according to EU directives. We also have assessments like the strategic environmental assessment and the environmental impact assessments, which is also known in the US. And of course, we have sectoral plans like forestry, transportation, waste management. But I would like to concentrate on comprehensive spatial planning and landscape planning, as those are the most important ones, and they are, yeah, for our issues, and they are kind of area covering, and spatial planning has to include all the other interests or plans which exist into its plan. So it has a kind of coordinating function. As I learned, and if I'm not misled, the adaptation strategies or the New Jersey resilient strategy are informal planning instrument. There is no legal basis for it, and no one is really legally obliged to follow it. And that's the same situation we have in Germany. There are quite a lot of counties or regions or municipalities, and also some federal states who already have come up with adaptation concepts and strategies. Sometimes those adaptation strategies can also be part of, yeah, a climate protection or an energy concept as well. So all climate issues are, yeah, bound together in one document, but very often they are adaptation concepts are independent from climate protection concepts. I have roughly and kind of superficially analyzed 48 of those adaptation concepts, which have been set up between 2012 and 19. It was superficial, so it was only, I only had a look on the title of the chapters or sections to find out what the focus of those concepts is. Regarding climatic changes, most of them, 22, dealt with heat waves, 19 with extreme precipitation events, and some also with extreme wind events or drought. Regarding the environmental or natural assets, there we have water, yeah, on the front line, but also nature and green was dealt with by 21 of those concepts, and only 7 dealt with soil. There was a broad range of land uses like building, transportation, energy, agriculture, forestry, and tourism. The concepts dealt with, and also with human health and recreational possibilities for humans. Most of them suggested measures, so there was only one who did not suggest any measure to adapt to climate change. And most of them also referred to formal planning instruments, as, yeah, it seemed to be quite clear that it's necessary to integrate the measures into formal planning instruments so that they are legally binding for the actors on local or regional level. Public participation and, yeah, involvement of the broader public is also an issue which was dealt with by quite many of those concepts. An interesting thing that most of this concept had state funding. So there was a program by our national government on setting up adaptation concepts, and most of those concepts were, yeah, made with help by that funding, which shows that if there is no state funding, municipalities tend not to have a kind of adaptation concept. So this shows the necessity or the importance of federal funding in order, yeah, to get the municipalities or counties or regions on track, yeah, if I would like to put it that way. To come back to something what has been said this afternoon, that municipalities would be creatures of federal, state, or federal and state governments. I put not it that hard for Germany due to 2 reasons. At least municipalities can do nothing, and they could reject any activities regarding climate change adaptation. And on the other hand, they are rather powerful in regards to spatial planning. They have a so-called Planungshoheit, which means planning sovereignty, which allows them to decide how their area has to be developed, of course, within the legal and the planning framework, but they have quite a lot of power to decide about their own area. At least they have more power than the regional level. So, coming to the third point, now the question is, can this climate adaptation be integrated into formal planning? And I would like to consider that on 3 points: methods, the legal basis and requirements, and last but not least, practice. So I would say we have the methods, we have a broad methodology, we have handbooks and guidelines. This one, for example, for spatial planning and land use planning on local level. This is something like, yeah, a climate change toolkit that Dave has mentioned, also with some tables what can be done, or with maps or with figures who showed how certain topics can be or should be displayed on maps. The same for landscape planning. This is a guideline developed at my department, a catalog of potential adaptation measures which could be used by municipalities. Then, how to say, a profile for different aims which have been worked out for some case study municipalities, to have contact with the municipalities from the very beginning, and also, again, example maps. To the legal requirements, I would, due to time reasons, not run through all the paragraphs, but what can be said is that all federal acts regarding the spatial planning on state and regional level that we have here, but also on local level, as well as for landscape planning, all the laws say that climate change adaptation and climate protection should be an issue of all those planning activities and should be integrated, or at least can be integrated into the respective plans. So we have a good legal basis and we also have a good methodological basis. The question now is, how is practice? This is a chart from the monitoring report on the German adaptation strategy, and it shows whether or not, or how many landscape plans consider climate change. And this is an analysis for landscape master plans on the regional level, around about 150, and the landscape programs of the federal states, which are 16. And what you can see here is that, we have an increase of the consideration of climate change on both levels. But what you can also see here, there are different categories. And the first one, so the highest one, is just the simple mentioning of climate change or climate change relevant areas without deriving any aims or measures or consequences from it. It was just said, okay, climate change could be a problem or something like that. Category 2 is a bit more. It's that impacts of climate change on biodiversity are described. Category 3A, which is this one, says that there are single aims or measures justified inter alia by climate change and its impacts. And category 3B are justified by climate change and its impacts more or less alone. So that's on the regional and state level. And that's the last slides on the local level. A new study on 10 cities between 100 and 300,000 inhabitants, which already had an informal adaptation concept. And the authors had a look at 10 preparatory land use plans of those cities and on 2 binding land use plans of each of those cities. And they defined 24 measures from 6 fields of actions, buildings, green and open spaces, and so on, and had a look whether or not those measures had been included or considered in the plans. And what you see here is that quite a lot of the preparatory land use plans have considered adaptation measures on green and open spaces, but much less, for example, on infrastructure. And what you can also see is that in most cases, the binding land use plans have considered much less adaptation measures than the preparatory land use plan. So the more concrete it becomes, the less relevant are adaptation measures. So these are examples for the adaptation measures. And
Excuse me, Stefan, we need you to wrap up in a couple of minutes.
yep, this is my second last slide. So these are, if you have a look at those measures, these are not kind of very new measures or aims. Yeah, these have been known for kind of decades. Yeah, it only means that climate change gives a new urgency to those measures, is another argument for those measures, but actually it's nothing really new. So to come to the conclusion, what I've already mentioned, knowledge and methods exist. The legal framework is okay, but planning practice or formal planning practice has not yet taken full advantage of existing possibilities. Many measures for climate change adaptation are not entirely new, but have already often been used over a long time for different other purposes. And the last point that I have not mentioned before, I think it's important, and that was also mentioned before by Rob. He talked about a coordinated approach, that we create intersectoral working structures to ensure an ongoing consideration of climate change adaptation. So thank you for surviving, and I hope that I'm not too much in delay. Sorry for that.
Thank you, Stefan. Thanks to everybody on the panel. Very stimulating, interesting presentations. I look forward to questions and some discussion now. So I would like to invite everyone in the audience here in the room here at Rutgers University in New Jersey to ask questions. And I will also invite everybody who's watching on Zoom to post questions into the chat. And I will wait to see who is first, and I'll call on them as they come in order. If you want to ask questions here in the room, I'll give you the microphone. If you want to introduce yourself, feel free.
Hi, everybody. This is a question for anyone on the panel. My name is Katrina Leary. I'm the legislative aide for Assemblyman Karabinchak in Edison, New Jersey. We've seen recently, we do a lot of clean energy and climate change resiliency efforts, but there's oftentimes a mismatch between the demand and what we can supply. So, it ends up, there's new construction of greenhouse gas facilities or new constructions of regular gas stations. How do we meet the supply and be able to provide the supply without putting strain on the energy grid and being able to implement more of these clean energy measures and climate change resiliency measures while still meeting the supply of a growing population and everything on those lines? That makes sense?
Anyone want to take that? Go ahead.
Okay, I could start if you don't mind. I'm not sure if I got the question absolutely correctly, but I think it's the question of energy transformation. And that's a big issue that we have in Germany as well, especially with the rising energy prices at the moment. And there's a big discussion. I think that we have done quite a lot on wind energy and also on solar energy, but yeah, it has been decreasing during the last few years due to firstly political will or ill will. So there was a kind of, yeah, one could say they tried to put an obstacles into it by our Ministry of the Economy. And of course, there's always the question of acceptance. So there's a broad acceptance on renewables in general in Germany. We want to protect the climate. We would like to get out of the nuclear power. Therefore, we need renewables. But if it comes close to where you live, yeah, then the problems start. And that's not only a NIMBY, so not in my backyard phenomena, but it's the question of how you deal with people, of whether or not they are able to get involved into those wind farms, for example, and to get benefits from it or not. So that's a question of how you involve people, how you deal with them, and whether they have the feeling that they are really, yeah, in it and that they are taken seriously, or whether there is some planning authority just doing something against their will. So I think that's one of the main problems. And of course, there is a kind of a fossil fuel lobby still that we have to face and to deal with. And what another point, I think, what we must not forget is, of course, even renewables need resources, need energy, need areas, can have an impact on nature and landscapes. Therefore, we should not only try to save our energy consumption or energy demand, but also to reduce it. And that's something which should not only be done by technological means, but that's what we are asked for ourselves, yeah, to think how we can reduce, all of us, our, let's say, individual energy demand.
Now, I'll just add to that. I'm at least not glad, but gratified to hear that Germany is struggling with this transition too. I think we're all focused on the transition, but we're at the point where our ambitions are outpacing our kind of reality. And usually, when you make a transition, you need something smooth to transition to. We're just getting the first offshore wind farms kind of up. Not up yet, getting through the process so that they will be up. We're just getting EVs on the road at a real scalable, in a real scalable way, but we're still far behind where we need to be, where the urgency requires we be, and where targets tell us where we should be. So this is hard. Because at the end of the day, we still need to go. We still need to go where we need to go. We still need heat and cooking ability in our homes. And if there's nothing to transition to yet at such a scale, we're still going to struggle with this. So New York passed a climate leadership community protection act where it set goals and said they legislatively have to be at 80%, 85% renewable by 2050. They are laying out the process to get there, but they still don't know how they're going to get there. New Jersey has a global warming response act, but it doesn't have a legislative mandate that we have to be at a certain level. So it's going to be a long, tough road. I think we're willing to go there, but you need to have the thing to transition to in order to make the transition. We're just catching up.
Thanks, Rob. Any other questions from the audience? Great. I just want to say I don't see any questions in the Zoom chat, so I think Zoom chat's working, but no one's posted a question there yet. So feel free to do so.
Thank you very much. So my name's Jim Lyons, and I'm kind of a retired policy maker in Washington, D.C., returning to New Jersey. Of concern. One is we're behind, although I'm glad to see that aggressive efforts are underway to try to create the framework to deal with adaptation. The other sense I get is that we will never have the resources that are necessary to really effectively deal with these issues. So one question I have is, at least in the context of the presentations you made today, why is it that natural resources efforts, for example, to engage in reforestation or regenerative agriculture, wetland restoration, land conservation more broadly, which obviously is an important factor in mitigating the effects of climate. Why didn't that come up? Maybe it wasn't just your area of focus today, but I wonder why those opportunities aren't part of, at least from the presentations today, part of the strategy for adaptation and dealing with these issues. The professor from Germany, I think, did point to that as part of his slides, but also showed that biodiversity and nature were kind of low in terms of the elements that were considered. So how does that fit into the structure overall? And Rob and you and I talked about this a little while ago with regard to the meadowlands and the opportunities that exist to use the wetlands and the meadowlands as a mitigation measure. Unfortunately, we'll probably spend 100 times more money trying to protect the infrastructure that's already there, as opposed to just simply deciding to protect that landscape and use it as an effective mitigation tool. Your thoughts?
I don't know if Dave wants to jump in there, but I think it's a good point that part of the adaptation toolbox and part of the mitigation toolbox are natural lands, wetlands, forests, regenerative soil and ag. And I think that does need to be absolutely part of the equation. I didn't mention it, but our fourth plan said, the meadowlands should be, over time, as sea levels rise, transition to become a natural landscape. That would involve buyouts, that would involve a managed plan of retreat in the meadowlands. That's controversial. Buyout, New Jersey has a buyout program, and it's the best in the nation. And Fawn McGee is doing a tremendous job running it. The amount of money that goes to buyout programs compared to, say, coastal engineering is minuscule. And I think we may take this opportunity to rebalance and shift resources. But the primary thing here is kind of keeping people safe. And I think we're gonna have to get over a little bit of a hurdle for thinking that we can protect every community. But as we get over that hurdle, we can also restore natural lands and maybe even sequester carbon in the process.
So I didn't hear the whole question. The speaker was a little low, but I would point out that the resilience strategy includes right up front priority 2, strengthening resilience of New Jersey ecosystems. And if you look at strategies underneath, it's all about making sure that we don't neglect the various ecosystems we have for their sake, but also for what they provide to us. So we have not ignored that at all. It's a dominant strategy out of the 5.
So to add from my side, thanks for the question, and I absolutely agree. But yeah, it was somehow not the topic, and I was even too long. I fear that Roger already got a bit nervous. But of course you're right, and those nature-based solutions are of course an important contribution to climate change adaptation and mitigation. And by the way, what I think is that biodiversity, or we do not only have a climate crisis, we also have a biodiversity crisis. And I fear that in 5 or 10 years we might wake up and say, oh, we have a biodiversity crisis and science has told us, but we weren't awake enough, and then we start, and then it might be too early, too late. So I think we have to to think that at least two crises together and think how, yeah, conflicts of aims could be minimized and how synergies, for example, wetlands, yeah, could be realized and made use of.
Great, thank you, panelists. I have a question from the Zoom chat from a participant on Zoom. Dorina Frizera asks this: both RPA and NJDEP have robust adaptation plans, but do these plans also have milestones and responsibility for actions built in? There is a very real potential that these robust plans will languish on the shelf if there are no checks, balances, or opportunities for adaptive management of the plans.
So Doreen's right. There's been so many plans at the state level that have languished and disappeared, when administrations change. This is the first edition of the resilience strategy. We know that what she's put in here, the milestones and responsibilities, which have to be assigned to whatever entity they belong to, or whether it's a state agency or whether it's a local agency, all that has to be laid out, and that will be laid out in our second edition of the resilience strategy, because that has to be updated every 2 years. Hopefully, we'll do it more frequent than that. But we are very cognizant of the issue she brought up.
And I'll just add, since my former boss at the DEP is asking this question, Dorina, RPA, obviously we're a nonprofit organization. We do put in kind of who's responsible for these, but obviously we have no power, no authority to say how that gets done. We put in targets. Again, what New York has done with its Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act is legislatively mandate greenhouse gas emissions reductions. It's very hard on the adaptation side to kind of set legislative mandates like that, but I think there should be goals, targets, milestones, and measuring against how we're doing. And I'm glad to hear Dave say again that version 2.0 will have those, because that's critically important.
Okay, other questions from the audience? I want to take the liberty of extending the session a little later than 2:30 since we got started so late. And I want to pose a question to all the panelists, which is, what were the main obstacles that you've confronted so far in all the efforts that you've been describing? And if you can, also describe how you think you've been able to overcome them, or what you think you might need in order to be able to overcome them.
Could you state the first part of your question again, please?
Yeah, the main obstacles that you encounter in the efforts that you've described here. So we've been all very much on the positive here, describing all these really good planning activities. But in the background, there are contextual factors, political or economic actors or institutions that pose barriers. So I'm just wondering if you could address some of those, but also talk about how they can be overcome.
So from my perspective, I think that we're still having issues with the science and having people accept what we're really, what we are on board with. In other words, sea level rise is still, the idea of sea level rise, to the extent that we're seeing, is still being challenged on the outside. People don't want it to happen, and therefore we have to increase our efforts to make sure that people understand why we believe what we believe. And then it's having the entities, local governments, regional entities, whatever, understand that these are issues that are going to have to be dealt with starting now. Even though we have a year of 2100 planning horizon, climate change impacts are happening now, and they're going to increase exponentially. And the steps we take now are necessary. It's not like we can put this off until 2050, when you start to really see temperature increases expand. It has to start now. It's just hard for people to have an 80-year planning horizon when they're used to planning in 4-year chunks of time.
I'll add to that because I think that's right on. That this is the challenge here is that we have to adaptation means change, and we don't like to change. Change means a lot of things, and I remember we were doing the sea level rise report and we put out 1, 3, and 6 years. We gave a range of dates, but people are like, I want to know when that's going to happen. What date that will happen. We can't say that, so you have to plan for, in some ways, the worst case scenario, and that means changing business. That means not developing places. That means leaving areas that are at risk. That might even mean at some point turning down Army Corps billions of dollars in a place like the Back Bays, because we should be focusing on removing people from harm versus kind of locking them in place for longer. So these are controversial big issues that really gets down to the kind of individual level, municipal level, and these are decisions that have to be made for the next generation, by the generation now. We don't like to think like that. We just want to make sure we're okay for the next few years. But sure, we may buy ourselves some time for the next few years, but then that after those next few years, we're in more serious trouble than if we had planned ahead. And that's something really hard to get heads around.
And I would also add that you're talking not just about response to environmental issues, but the environmental issues are going to cause economic issues. So you have to deal with all the components of climate change at the same time. You don't want to ruin today's economy. You want to help plan it through the process and understand that what the strength of our economy today may be different than the strength of the economy in 30 years, and what drives that economy. So this is a huge task.
Okay, from the German side, I only can agree to everything you said. And my first answer somehow in the foreground would have been, okay, it's economic interests, it's money, it's habits within administration, it's different responsibilities within administration, it's kind of political competition. Yeah, this is my ministry and I do not want to do what the other ministry arranged by the other party wants to do, and so. But behind, my feeling is that we do fear either or to tell or to hear the truth. Yeah, and there is not enough political courage to tell the truth. I remember when we set up the adaptation plan for Berlin, the first one, yeah, we were told, okay, climate change is bad, but it doesn't have only bad sides. We also have to emphasize its good sides. Yeah, we can sit, if it's getting warmer, we can sit outside the bars even longer. I mean, yeah, New York will be drowning, yeah, but you can sit out 1 hour longer in the evening of the bar. I mean, it's crazy, but that shows how people try to find some things that, okay, we have climate change and we have to do something, but don't fear, it also has its good side. And I think we really have to face the full truth. And the full truth is that our house is either burning or drowning, or we have fire and we have too few or too much water. And unfortunately, fire and water are not in the same parts of our house. And now we have to deal with this issue. And that's the truth, which, yeah, no one or only a few people really, try to express.
Thank you, Stefan. I want to ask one more question of all the panelists, which is, if you think about your experience and try to think about what might be generalizable, what lesson, what conclusion from your experience in your jurisdiction might travel outside it? I'm not going to necessarily ask you whether it might travel across the ocean to Germany or to the United States respectively, but just, outside the boundaries of your area, just one lesson that we can take away from from what you've given us.
I mean, I'll go back to kind of those climate adaptation network conversations we had. It was really interesting where, and this is the boundary in our region, which could extend, beyond across oceans. But, you had Camden talking to a municipality out on Long Island. That had never happened before, yet they were kind of relating to each other, sharing the same ideas, sharing information with each other that can help each other. I think the positive thing here is that we're in this together. We're seeing this here with Stefan, that we're dealing with the same issues. And I think that's a positive takeaway from this, and one we should embrace more, is that we're facing these challenges together, and hopefully we can kind of find solutions together if we share across the boundaries more than we are.
Yeah, I've been sitting on a group sponsored by the Pew Trust, group of chief resilience officers from around the state or from around the country. And it's a very interesting exchange of information. And I think the most interesting part, as Rob points out, regardless of the part of the country, the chief resilience officers are having the same issues. And that almost calls out for, it does call out for some federal oversight or involvement in what we're doing, because the solutions are often going to be the same. And as the federal government decides where to put its money, the states should be in equal positions in talking to the federal government, knowing that of course there's going to be political gamesmanship as to where money should go, et cetera. But there really should be a prioritization at the national level as to how we're going to deal with this. Yeah.
Stefan, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, that's a hard question, the take home message. I think that we have a kind of a problem of big figures. Yeah, there are millions or billions of people causing a climate change, some much more than others, by the way. And so everybody says, no, it's not me. In Germany, we have the discussion, we are only responsible for 2% of, and the Chinese and the US. But we are only 1% of the Earth's population, and even the US alone or China alone would not save the climate or the Earth because they are too small for themselves. Yeah? And with our 2%, we are on 5th or 6th position on the Earth. Yeah, so there are 195 countries behind us. So what should they say? So we know there is a lot of very little things, but this means that we also have to face these little things, because that's the only thing we can do. And if everyone says, no, not me, because my contribution is only a very, very small one, then no one will do anything. And I think that the most important thing is to break this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy or the social ecological dilemma that it's always the other because my contribution is so neglectable.
Thank you, Stefan. And thank you everyone. Thank you panelists, thank you the live audience, thank you the Zoom audience. Thank you for bearing with us during some technical glitches. And most of all, thank you for the rich and interesting and lively discussions that we've had here.